my god.
Yeah, we say well,
会被挡到。你看还好。
经济条件不好啊。我在这个他们医疗，他们变给你起什么？还有那是疾病，
They were
They
participate in the younger, teaching the younger generation anyway. So that's happening. So I can't do that. That's people.
但是最穷那一代的。
那个时候，我记得有一些。
Workers this year.
Anything we're gonna like, and also like so I'll let them know.
1980左右来的话就不一样。
可以啊，现在应该 live 吧。
I don't know what
Yeah, I'm a little concerned if we're. I don't think we can pick up the sound enough. We also kind of the Well, I mean, if we don't
思想上的解放，第三种，从民主对建立这种国家，都是比较贵族的，或者从民主建立那几个家，不能生命、政治、经济、文化有共同体的念念，那这个东西很清楚了，很明显当同的一个自由的，这个是民主也是来建构起来的，这历史因素，历史原它等等让现在爱情是非常重要的。我是觉得你现在这个时代，个人感觉是人生。所以说你在上班时间，就是那个业成年，就那个培养企业。 然后他们东西啊，也像我个人，我比较
He wants to live where there's still floods and all this stuff, so we argue a lot. Waiting list of this building. Right, so he has, it's gonna be. So your organization is.
We both are.
And that is. I met her and she told me.
She's also
okay, I remember her very well.
She was
I loved her work.
yeah, she's like
Getting to know, it was
yeah, she's very Oh yeah, the thing
like I would raise yeah, it was that idea back then.
ourselves needs to be
That in turn. Yeah, way back, yeah, oh my gosh. And then the last yes, yes. Right. So I was that idea that others in the room. Well, we can talk another time. Yeah, it's not, but it's really to Again, I'll just next week.
I know we'll keep thinking about it. We're thinking about
It's the only. Yeah, it is. Right. This is a big topic for us. Right.
we hear them whether the
Right. Congratulations. I respect that so much because I know how much you did on the part.
Carrie got out.
It's really people are
Right. That's what you face.
nobody.
Yes, I understand very well. You know, like
Yes.
Do people interact with us while we talk, or if we just talk, or?
So we will have some people that don't understand.
We're trying to get back on.
I don't think people
要入境吗？
哦，不用了。OK， 好。
It's a lifetime brain, challenge.
I think that's around. Part of it, post-graduate. So I'll ask people who's lived in the front, and then you guys.
Is there a?
An expert in kind of a science. True grassroots and it's an anti-think tank. It takes a think tank to understand.
Oh, okay.
So how do you
How do you think? But I think they already set up the so maybe people can think of something you guys can use things here with this or that. Or if you think it's better, we can move the house in like a U shape. Is that better? Okay. So people can start, and then because we don't have microphones today, so I want to ask everyone to.
I don't need a microphone.
So they don't need to shout for the whole time.
Yeah, maybe.
And then, so everybody sit on the couch, please.
You got a cold too? Well, it's the same one as you and I.
热字梦纯 and 应家 please. Because then they don't need to shout. Come on. 哎，怎样？
I'll take that.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, I'm judging by the size of the steak.
哦，觉得大家往前坐啊。这样比较有，就比较有。
刚会睡着。
哪来的技术？ Okay.
Oh no.
Press the button again. All right.
Okay, so we'll have everybody introduce themselves. So first of all, welcome to this April's Cafephilo at Boston event. And Cafephilo, I think I introduced you guys a little bit. It was originated in Taiwan, and then for people to increase their civil participation and with different social issues, including culture. And it's actually flourished in Taiwan since when, like 2011 or 12? These couple of years. And I think it's already expanded to more than 15 cities or 20 cities in Taiwan, big and small. And in the US, it started in New York and then Boston is the second time. We started last year in October. And so this is just, the event is to encourage discussion among different social groups, especially encouraging local participation. So this is a perfect setting for us to, you guys can learn about how it works. And so the tradition of Cafephilo is to do a self-introduction in the 10-15 seconds. And then I would like to ask everyone to introduce your name and then where you're from and also why you come here. Yeah, I can start first. So I'm Ho Cho, and I'm a cancer biologist and I'm a postdoc in Boston Children's Hospital. And I'm here because I am interested in civil participation, and I want to encourage this kind of thing. Okay.
I'm Ray. I'm right now a PhD student in American Engineering at AU. So the reason I come here is because I'm always interested in some social reaction to government or some left-wing action. So yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Tony. I'm PhD in ECS, and like for the Sunflower Movement, I feel that the social forum has a really great impact than like other social movement before. So I'm really interested in this talk.
My name is Ji Feng. I'm a postdoc in material science at MIT. The reason I'm here is because I'm interested in all kinds of social movements. For instance, Occupy Wall Street, and so I'm very excited to listen to your your experience in all kinds of activity here in Boston.
My name is John Jun. I work in the manufacturing industry. I'm here because I love to know how other groups grow and how other take from their experiences.
Hello, I'm Miguel, or Watson, in the economy. I'm a master's student of the science in Boston University. I think that explains everything. It's very legitimate for me to be here. So nice to meet you guys.
I'm an already PhD student in health economics studies. I'm here to know about the subjectivity law.
Hi, I'm Mongton. I go back on. I'm a postdoc in psychology at Cambridge Hospital. And I'm here because I'm interested in the intersection between psychology and sociology. So I'm very...
Oh, great. We're good case study.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in social activist movement, and I also am interested in learning more about how social media can foster social activism.
I'm Betsy. I'm a homemaker, and I think I'm here because I'm very interested in social justice, and I'm always interested in social justice, and so that's why I'm here.
My name is Marisa Figueiredo. I am here because I participated in the Boston Social Forum with the Women's Liberation track at the time. I've been in Red Stockings since the early 80s. I work at the Boston Veterans Administration Hospital. I'm a physician assistant in gastroenterology. And Jason and I have been together a long time working for social justice in the US. So I'm excited about meeting all of you and all of us learning together some of the great lessons from the Boston Social Forum.
My name is Rocky Chow. I'm Betsy's husband. And like Betsy, and I'm also interested concerned about social justice. As a matter of fact, we got married in our joint pursuit of social justice. That's why I'm here.
My name is Yingzhen Chen, and I work at a startup biotech here. And because lots of my friends are very active with things regarding Taiwan, Taiwan's democracy, or social activation activists, and so I just wanted to hear what everybody thinks.
I guess.
Albert, do you want?
Sure. I'll go ahead and go. Here. So this is my name's Herbert. I work here at this company. We're a software startup in television advertising specifically. As for the last year, providing the space and all that, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. But more importantly, I think that for me, this is being active and making our voices heard is something that I care a lot about, and a large part of why I'm involved in a lot of these different movements, or at least try to participate as much as I can. So a little bit about the space. Clearly, this this is an office space. So we work here. All of this stuff is available, from the beer to the coffee is available for consumption. There are also snacks. So we have plenty more wherever those came from. Be fed and be merry, all that. A couple other logistics. We are trying to tighten up the security space in this space. That's why there's a lot of doors to go through and whatnot. Let me know if you want to use the restroom because I'll just give you the access card. That way you can get back into the space. Less hassle that way. And also the bathroom code is 231. That is applicable for both genders. Make sure you go to the right one. Or maybe it doesn't really matter because it's Sunday, so don't go there anyway. But bathroom code is 231 for anybody that really needs to use the facilities. And that might be, I don't know if anybody else needs to get on the Wi-Fi, but we have a guest network with a negative control on there as well. So yeah, I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Robert. Stephanie?
Stephanie. I am a PhD student in biostatistics, and I've been in Boston for 6-7 years, so I'm interested in, I guess I've never participated in this stuff for, well, like, the social movement in Boston, but I'm interested in
Okay. I'm Jason Pramas. I'm an assistant professor of communications at Lesley University. In a couple of months, because I've been one of the leaders of the union drive of faculty over there, I will probably not be an assistant professor of communications at Lesley University. So I might be an adjunct. We'll see. But we'll see how that all goes. And I was coordinator of the Boston Social Forum, which we'll talk about in a second.
So I'm Suren Moodliar. I'll say my name again, Suren, S-U-R-E-N. And I'm sure most of you in the room, given that you're not from the United States, often have to respell your names, so you know why I'm respelling mine.
It's not even the full name. So.
I'll just say something really quickly. The topic of social justice and social change activism has been central to my life, as it is to every single human being's life in the world, except that I've been conscious of the fact that it's central to my life. And one of the reasons I've been conscious of that is I grew up in South Africa when it was under the old government, the government that was a white minority government. So issues were very clear. The situation of injustice was very clear. The lines were drawn very clearly. The lesson it taught me that I will talk about after Jason's presentation is that much of social change work is about drawing lines and erasing lines. We want to know who the us and the them are, and we also want to figure out how we can make the them the us. And so that's what my talk will be about, and it will be a little bit more theoretical than that. So, one more thing. I help run a space in Boston that's inspired by the social forum process. It's called Encuentro Cinco, it's Spanish word for meet five. And it's inspired by the notion of the open space. You're welcome to visit it. The website is Encuentro, the word Encuentro, numeral5.org. And it's also a space where people can walk in and host events of this nature as well. Okay? And it's in downtown Boston.
Can you say that again?
So it's Encuentro, so ENCUENTRO, number5.org.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and this is in downtown Boston, right by Park Street.
I might need some lights. Is that possible?
I just figured that while we're projecting,
right.
But
I'm not going to project anything. What?
You still want the stuff?
I think Surendo's doing.
Yeah,
during his talk. Yeah.
Okay.
I just might want to read a couple things.
I don't have spotlights for you. All right.
Oh no, I don't want a spotlight. I get like a sinus headache.
In the meantime, you guys said if there's any questions, then people can just write.
Yeah. We're going to be referencing, especially I will, some American history, politics, this kind of stuff, and I realize people won't necessarily know what I'm referring to. I'm trying to explain stuff as I go along. And this is a huge topic we're addressing in a short time. So we want to be relaxed about it. So if we skip something, if something is not clear, just let us know. We'll explain. Okay. So I know that globally the reputation of the United States is that it's a very rich country, and it is, right? But I think the conceit is that everybody's very well off, and that's not true, right? So that's something to start with right away. There have been periods of the United States, history when more people have been doing better than maybe not, but that has not been most of our history. Let's see, another thing I should say is that the U.S. has a very particular problem with racism. You can't look at American politics and history without understanding, the oppression of what we call people of color, but African Americans, Black people, and also Asian people from various countries, people basically from everywhere else in the world, Latin America, and so on and so forth, have been treated very, very badly. It should also be understood that it's a country of immigrants. This is true, and that even white immigrants like my own family, who were from Greece, had a very hard time when we came here, and for a long time after we came here, right? So my generation, I'm 48 years old now, so I was born in 1966. So I was growing up in the 70s and early 80s as a young person. That was sort of the tail end of the good times for American working people, right? And by working people, I mean working class and middle class, what we call middle class here. That's most of the American population, right? I want to just talk a little bit about what was changing in that period and how it led people like me to become active. Because most people in my family's position, as people that were moving, white, ethnic, Americans who had been immigrants, my parents' parents came here, right, about 100 years ago, right? We had been moving up the economic food chain because of social movements that had happened between the 1930s and the 1960s, essentially, that helped us. And my family made it to what we would call the middle class, like low-level managers by the 1980s, by the time I was a teenager. But my culture was a working class culture, right? And so that American working class had been kind of depoliticized in many places. Not unlike, I think, the situation people tell me about Taiwan. Like when you talk about having Cafephilo to encourage civic participation, that tells me there hasn't been civic participation, at times over the decades. And no, I know it's getting there now. My understanding is that during the period of like the White Terror and all this stuff, it was hard to have a politics. There was Kuomintang. I know I pronounce all these words badly, I'm sorry. But, there was one government and one party that pretty much dominated everything. And anybody that did anything else, especially on the political left, at best had to keep quiet, I think, except maybe sometimes there were rebellions, sometimes there was student, unrest, this kind of thing. But mostly people were quiet. That was sort of like where I grew up. I mean, people had been very active in the 1930s in my hometown of Peabody, Massachusetts, just north of Boston, where people worked in leather factories, okay? So my family were factory workers, and the conditions were very, very bad. And then in the 1930s, around 1932, it became possible for working people in those factories to unionize. So people did. There was big, big struggle. So the American labor movement won a decent standard of living for at least families headed by white working class men, like my father's family was in this case, between about 1932 through to the early 70s. So there was significant labor activity, but we have to understand that by the late 1940s, there was an anti-communist reaction that hurt the labor movement very badly because many of its leaders were socialists and communists, which is true in many countries. And communism and socialism mean different things in different countries. But we're talking about broadly left-wing movements, people that wanted more equality for more people in society, both economically and politically, okay? So, and my family suffered during this period because my grandfather was active in the labor movement, and this movement was periodically crushed. So he would lose his job and then start over again and this kind of thing. So the McCarthy era slowed things down for American workers between the late 40s and the maybe early 60s. But in the 1960s, major social movements rose up, right? There were a number of them. The civil rights movement is extremely important, where African-American people fought for basic rights, just like Suren and his friends did in South Africa later, well, actually during the whole period. And won many important rights, including legal rights, like the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that basically affirmed that black people were citizens like white people were in the US, and affirmed their political and economic rights. There was also a huge anti-war movement, led by students, but also by many working people, a movement against the American invasion of Vietnam and all the many negative consequences that came in that region and globally from that claim. And there was a huge women's liberation movement that started in the late 60s through the mid 70s or so, yes. And that had a huge effect, right? And what this meant was that a lot of people that were not in the workforce that was unionized, that had not had good jobs in the private and public sector, and did not have power through their labor unions, started to enter those kinds of jobs or to unionize their jobs in the late 60s and early 70s. So you had, it was no longer just white men that had the better jobs. Now, black people, people from different countries in Asia, different countries in Latin America, had more possibilities of getting the better jobs, as did women. And right at this period in 1973, capitalism overall worldwide faced a major crisis that economists sometimes call the Great U-turn, And I view it, this is my idiosyncratic view, I view it as a period when corporations, the big corporations globally, that many of which were based in the United States, went from making super profits to just profits. So they were very concerned about this, in part because of the organization of working people worldwide and also in the US. So more and more people were fighting for better conditions in their jobs as they were in their lives. And they were trying to take more control over the conditions of their employment too. So capital, the big corporations and politicians and thinkers affiliated with them, reacted with what we now call neoliberalism, which, just a quick Wikipedia definition, neoliberalism can be considered a resurgence of ideas associated with laissez-faire capitalism or laissez-faire economic liberalism beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, whose advocates support extensive economic liberalization, so-called policies, such as privatization of public goods, public programs, fiscal austerity, in other words, not spending on the public, only spending for what businesses want, right? Deregulation, meaning you stop regulating corporations and making them, for example, allow people to unionize, right? Deregulation stops people's ability to have democracy in the workplace, to have any say in the conditions of their employment, right? And it also affects the political sphere in general. All these things affect it because it becomes harder for people to have a civic life, for people to have a say in their lives, right? At any level. Politics increasingly becomes something that's run by the rich and the corporations they control, and the politics that everybody else participates in doesn't have power. Where the people, most people, are not able to exercise their power in what's supposed to be a democratic society. Free trade and reductions in government spending were also part of the neoliberal program in order to enhance the role of the private sector of corporations in the economy. Among the first practitioners of this kind of political economy was Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean dictator who took power from the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende in 1973. Margaret Thatcher followed this neoliberal dictum upon her election as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1979, and Ronald Reagan became the neoliberal standard bearer upon his election as President of the United States in 1980. So this is the climate that I grew up in. right, here in the US. Whereas my friends that were a little older than me, like maybe 16, 17, 18 years old, in the late 1970s, in the summer, when we were not in school, you want to get a job that's pretty good. So there were government jobs under something called the CETA program for young working people. In 1980 and 81, when Reagan took power, the first thing he did was cut all these programs, just gone, 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 gone. So then there was no good job for me to work in the summer. So then I had to like do what? I had to be a caddy, because my family was not wealthy, right? So they were doing better, but we went through various recessions, various difficult times in this period, and things got tough, and there were less social programs to help people. So I definitely needed to work, right? Starting from when I was about 16. So I would work on the golf course, carrying bags. I'm a little guy. It was kind of funny, I'm sure, to watch me carry the golf, And I would work in the mall at very lousy jobs that paid minimum wage, which remains very low. It's been getting lower and lower in real dollars since that time, but it was already low, And this continued when I went to college. I had a scholarship, but I still needed to work, and it was hard. It was not as hard for me as a white person as somebody who was black, but it was still difficult and getting more difficult, and it has continued getting more difficult through that period. So the jobs that I was getting, and of course I was politically active, I'm not going to talk about that, assume it, right? I got expelled from colleges and all this stuff for being a protest leader. It's not unlike, it's like a very small version of the sunflower stuff. I mean, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement to try to help Suren's country, for example. That movement, being a leader in that got me thrown out of Boston University, for example, by the very conservative president. So, I didn't graduate college at that time for another 15, 20 years, right? Until I went back to college and started getting degrees. So I had to work whatever job I could get. And in the period between the 1930s and the 1970s, I would have at least been able to get a factory job that paid well and was unionized and was pretty safe. My grandfather died in his factory. I probably would not have died, right? The safety conditions and stuff were much better, right? So those jobs were gone already. They were, the factories themselves were moving to the American South, where there was always less regulation and always less unions for a variety of reasons. And then those factories went to Mexico and then to Shenzhen, to places in Asia, or Taiwan. People used to, it was a big joke to see made in Taiwan. People used to assume goods and they're stealing our jobs and all this stuff. I mean, this was what working people here would say, right? So for 16 years, I worked these kinds of jobs, temp jobs, part-time jobs, day labor jobs, whatever I could get, while I was trying to do political work to improve the situation for my generation and for the society and the planet, right? And then I got involved in this group, which is the group that did that sparked the Boston Social Forum, the campaign on contingent work. I met a guy named Tim Costello in 1996, right after a magazine I was running for working young people who went under. I started working with Tim. Tim had been a labor guy, a union guy for a long time, but he was like a working class intellectual guy, which I had in common with him. He was about 20 years older than me, I think. And he had been involved in all kinds of struggles from the 1960s through to the time I met him. He'd already been in labor unions as a truck driver and doing other jobs for 20, 25 years at this point. And a lot of people in the labor movement and in the NGO sector in Boston and around the country would listen to him because he wrote books. He wrote some nice books about the situation for American working people and the need for democracy movements of various kinds. So over the next couple of years, we founded a group called the Campaign on Contingent Work. Okay? So contingent work is a very ugly, stupid term that economists use, and so we used for bad jobs in the so-called new economy. So what is the new economy? The new economy is the neoliberal economy. The new economy is the economy where labor costs go from being fixed because of unions, like corporations have to pay a certain amount of money, government has to pay a certain amount of money for labor costs. Under neoliberalism, that goes away. Corporations want to pay as little as possible and make as big profits as possible, right? So the jobs that they started to offer were these temp jobs, part-time jobs, contract jobs, independent contract jobs, day labor jobs, prison labor jobs, which is a big sector. Our country has more prisoners, I think, than anybody else in real numbers. And those people work for cheap or free. And that work is done for corporations like Amazon. This is the contingent economy. This is the neoliberal economy. So we were looking for ways. We were sort of a think tank and an action group that tried to figure out ways that labor unions and NGOs and civil society groups, religious groups, anybody that was interested in a more democratic society could, we were trying to figure out tactics and strategies that would help people organize basically for more democracy, okay? And so we did this in Boston, and then by 2000, we started a group that then hired Suren and another friend of ours, Kim Foltz, a group called the North American Alliance for Fair Employment, which is sort of like a bigger version, a continental version of the Campaign on Contingent Work. So the Campaign on Contingent Work has to be seen in the context of the global justice movement that rose up in the 1990s. You know, the things that we face in the US were being faced all over the world, right? Basically, corporations trying to run everything. Essentially what's going on. So it affected Taiwan more than it affected probably us in the US, I think. And many, many countries. So the reaction was a movement that started to look, for example, at the big trade treaties. They call these things trade treaties. They're not trade treaties. They're very political treaties. So the World Trade Organization and others would come up with treaties like, what's an example? In 99, what was the?
It was the WTO itself being ratified.
Yeah. So NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, stuff like this. There were these big agreements that were being negotiated outside the political sphere, right? So they were basically being negotiated by people who were connected with corporations and also parts of the United Nations, more importantly, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, right? Were negotiating these treaties together with the leaders of major corporations, okay? So a lot of the civil society organizations in the 90s and the American labor movement, which we began to shake out of its, we would say, torpor. The labor movement had been kind of asleep since the 1970s through the 1990s. It started to wake up, okay? And there were big protests. So in Seattle in 1999 at the World Trade Organization meeting on these kinds of treaties, there was a big protest, and it was not expected by the people doing the treaty negotiation. And basically the protesters included, and this you'll find this funny in the Taiwanese context because it was a blue-green coalition. And I know that you have like a blue coalition and like a green coalition. So in this case, when we say blue, we mean labor. And when we say green, we mean environmentalists, right? So it was also called the Teamster Turtle Coalition. There are other, but 30,000 people, which is a sizable demonstration. 50,000 people. You got it over. Actually shut down the negotiations for a while, and they put on the world stage using social media. By the way, the Independent Media Center was founded there, the Indie Media Movement, which was really the pioneer of using available social media, right? You know, relatively early internet technology to get videos and audio and photos and lots of text out to the world, and then that got picked up by the global media. So this protest was not, as often happens with these things, shut down. There was like, it wasn't a situation where nobody knew about it, everybody knew about it. And so people began to ask, well, gee, what is wrong? Why should we be concerned about, it's just a trade treaty. What do we care about trade treaties? Well, trade treaties allow major corporations to completely go around national governments or international government. It lets corporations do whatever they want to do, okay? They're allowed to move capital, for example, wherever they want to move it, move money, wherever they want to move it, but people are stopped from moving between national borders, you know? They allow big corporations to flaunt basic human rights, you know, laws, and flaunt labor laws, flaunt, you know, laws on civil rights, you know, whatever. Just do whatever they want. So that you see the rise of the so-called free trade zones. Shenzhen would be one. I'm sure Taiwan has them too. The maquiladoras on the American-Mexican border are another example. Just factories with no regulation, where anything can happen. You know, workers can be treated however, and they produce things cheaply for the global market, and there are no longer tariffs that allow countries to collect duties on imports and exports that might help the national government spread the wealth, right? So anything that spreads wealth to more people is out in these treaties. Okay? So the campaign on contingent work at the local level was, we were doing things like, for example, there was a group of, in 1997, when we were first getting going, there was a group of 20 older women in their 50s and 60s who worked for a chain of stores called Woolworths. I don't know if you know Woolworth. If you don't know, it's because it ceased to exist in the United States after this period. They had been working there a long time, and there was no union there, but it was a paternal corporation, the Japanese model, the team management model. It was a little better than just crazy anything goes capitalism. So they had the expectation of retiring with a pension. Well, as they were approaching retirement, new management took over Woolworth Corporation and said, you are now going to be let go, but before we get rid of you with nothing, maybe a month pay if you work there 30 years, maybe a week pay if you work there 5 years, okay? We want you to train temp workers to do your jobs. So a woman who was Chinese contacted the Chinese Progressive Association, which is one of the many groups we work with in Boston, and Tim and I went and tried to help these women, and so we started doing regular demonstrations and getting a lot of press and making Woolworths look really bad. We were not able to save their jobs. You know, we had many, many fights like this. But just the very idea that a non-union group of workers, older women workers, would fight in public and would leaflet all over downtown Boston in office buildings, and all the office workers loved them. You know, it was a very popular struggle, was important. It was, we were trying tactics, right? And it led to, years later, a government settlement that won $3.5 million for 400 workers like them around the US. So at least they got $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 later. It was something. And without fighting, we wouldn't have gotten that. And we had many fights like this. We got involved in many fights because bad jobs in the new economy relate to many different sectors of life. So we would work with immigrant groups, right? Because immigrants are in bad jobs, everybody. You know, unless you're, well, like you all went to university and came here and you work, you know, like postdocs, whatever, and then you might get better jobs, although you're less likely to than you were 30 years ago. It's still different than coming over a border or in a ship in the middle of the night and then working in some horrible factory or in a farm. That's what most people do as immigrants. So we work with immigrant groups. We work with day laborers that would go out on street corners and get work from guys that drove by in vans every day. And sometimes they wouldn't get paid and they would be treated very badly. We worked with adjunct faculty, right? Faculty that are contract faculty at universities around here, which had become a very big problem and remains one, right? And we wrote reports, we did legislative work, regulatory work, and we began to realize after years of doing this, it wasn't getting anywhere. We needed to do more than just individual little fights, okay, that sometimes got press. But like, it's sort of like we have civil society in the US, you can talk all you want in the US, but when it comes to actually changing anything, it's extremely difficult. So we were like, we need to do something bigger. And around 2001, in Porto Alegre in Brazil, in southern Brazil, there was an event that was done by Brazilian civil society groups, you know, NGOs, unions, together with some French groups, actually from France, you know, that were the same kinds of groups there, basically. And they called it the World Social Forum. And Suren will talk more about the World Social Forum proper. But we thought, I'm at 25 minutes, I'm sorry. Well, I'm just gonna lead into you, you know, it's like, we thought we should do one in Boston, okay? So just to use the language we use, just so you get an idea of what we were doing, and then I'll let Suren talk. No, I won't take 10 minutes. I'll take this bit here. So there's a whole story about the 20 months we spent organizing between November 2002 and July 2004 when we did the event. But essentially we found out that the Democratic Party, which is one of our two parties, right? And yeah, two is better than one, not much better than one. We really need a parliamentary system in the United States. We don't have it, okay? So we knew that they were gonna have their national convention here in July 2004. And we were like, gee, should we protest it? And I mean, I'm saying me and Suren and our friends, we were always talking about stuff. And we're like, you know, if we protest, it's going to be weak. We just don't have the ability. We don't have the base yet. All these organizations, the dozens and dozens of organizations in Boston, have a hard time mobilizing, let's say, I don't know, 5 to 20,000 people for a demonstration in a region where there's a couple of million in Eastern Massachusetts, right? And, you know, in a national event, sure, we could do better, but like, what will we be doing? Like, you know, I used to say that if we surrounded the Democratic National Convention with 1 million people, which there's precedent for in American history, and we stopped the proceedings, and then the leaders of the Democratic Party came out and said, well, what do you want? We weren't quite sure what we would tell them. So we're like, we like the World Social Forum process, which again, Suren will talk more about, because it was a process that said, what we need to do first is bring all these different civic groups together, right? In large events where they can network with each other, talk to each other more than they usually do. And they will do this before the event, during the event, and after the event. The event is important, but it's not the key thing. The key thing is the communication, and that the communication be constant, okay? And it's the idea of the social forum as open space for civil society groups to have conversations they normally don't have. What do we want? Or first to say, so Margaret Thatcher famously said, there is no alternative, Tina, there is no alternative to neoliberal capitalism. This is the best humanity can do, is to have a few rich people and a bunch of not rich people. And the rich people run everything. That's it. And we're like, no, we don't agree with this. What the World Social Forum said was another world is possible. It didn't say we know what the world is. I mean, we know that left-wing movements have tried all kinds of things, and some of them have resulted in very bad things. Like, I'm not a big fan of the People's Republic of China. I mean, I'm a socialist, yes, broadly, but I think that experiments like the PRC and the Soviet Union were, to be nice, flawed experiments. You know, they didn't work, right? They worked in some ways, but in some very real ways, they denied people their freedom. This is not acceptable. If you're on the left, the first thing you believe in is freedom. If you don't believe in freedom for people, I don't think you're on the left. That's my own opinion. Anyway, so we thought we should do this event in this style, and we should make it a regional event, which in the context of the World Social Forum process kind of meant a national event, but there was already a process for a United States Social Forum that was going very slowly, and was very concerned not to upset the labor movement who usually backed the Democratic Party. So we sort of said, okay, this will be basically a Northeast American event, but we're going to invite people from all over the US and all over the world. And people came from all over the US and all over the world, so that was nice. And I'll let Suren talk now. I'll just say what we said. The Boston Social Forum will be held on July 23rd to 25th, 2004, at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, just before the Democratic National Convention. A coalition of Boston area progressive community organizations, nonprofits, and unions will be hosting this forum. The BSF has been called to help progressive activists begin answering some very basic questions. What kind of future do we want for Boston, for our region, for our nation, for the world? What is our vision of a better society? Through a series of workshops, cultural events, plenary sessions, and giant convocations of the entire forum, we are encouraging progressive organizations of all kinds to showcase their analysis of the present and their ideas for the future across the breadth of human knowledge, politics, economics, science and technology, culture, and faith in the context of corporate globalization. The goals of the event are simple: encourage various social movements to exchange information, network with one another, form new alliances, and push our movements forward a bit more towards the next stage of human development. Okay.
So I'm going to start with what I suspect was going to be one of Jason's major points, that he took us all the way to the door, but didn't quite open the door. And so I'm going to open the door that Jason left some prizes behind. One of the biggest challenges we faced back then, we talked about 11 years ago, right? was that we were working on these different issues that were really important to us, right? We were concerned about immigrants' rights. We were concerned about the fact that there were day laborers working on the street corner and no regulation to help them not even imagine a decent job, but just a safe job, right? There were all of these crises. And related to it too, you could think of the adjunct faculty, which are in an even worse situation today than they were back then. Adjunct faculty back then, right, were worried about things like security of employment, knowing that, you know, in the next semester or the next academic year, you will have a job. They were also worried about the fact that there were part-time workers and there was no health care. One illness costs you that semester. One illness that semester not only costs you the semester, you probably won't be invited back for a job. There was this horrible insecurity. People in, and the French term, which has become the regular term now, right, is precarious employment. The precarious is one of the words that's used to describe this, right? And we were working on these issues, and we found that there was just no way in which we could achieve our goals without addressing other issues. So the moment you're thinking about what's going on the campus, with bad jobs on the campus, with these adjunct jobs, you're suddenly thinking about the fact of healthcare in the United States, which is a matter of federal policy. 10 years before the Boston Social Forum, there was an attempt to introduce some kind of healthcare reform by Hillary Clinton, and that went absolutely nowhere. And so this was the problem, that all the problems were interrelated, and yet we were working away in our own silos on particular issues. So we felt that the social forum model was the perfect place for us to, and as Jason made this point, to help develop, to help imagine something different that goes beyond the silos, for us to stop thinking within our boxes and try to figure out a world where there's wide open space, where we can plot our way forward. In other words, if we are going to imagine an alternative, we need to have the right kind of setting for it, right? Now, this is something old folks around the world know, right? When they're trying to arrange a marriage between two people, they're going to create a situation in which those two people can get together and hit it off. If not, the marriage is going to go nowhere, right? Any of you played the role of matchmaker with your friends, you know the problem, right? And this is what the social forum does, right? It creates an open space, or at least it aspires to create an open space where the right matches can be made, right? Except that there aren't a pair of old folks on the top guiding who will meet with whom. It's an open space that's relatively unregulated. And I want to say a bit more about that before going on to what I think have been some advancements in the process, right? So just chronologically, here's what I'm thinking about. Our very modest effort here in Boston, the Boston Social Forum in 2004, came after there were already about 3 World Social Fora held, right? So I'm using the word fora, Americans will say forums, right? So fora is the plural form of forum. And so there are 3 World Social Fora, and ever since then there's been World Social Fora as well, with the most recent one being held earlier this month, or in March, in Tunis, Tunisia, right? So it's an ongoing process. So the process begins in 2001 with the first World Social Forum. It's continuing to the present. In addition, right, we begin organizing in November 2002 for this process. We hold a small social forum in Boston in 2004, but then there's a massive US social forum in 2007 in Atlanta, and then again in 2010 there's a social forum in Detroit. And in addition to that, there's going to be a social forum in June in Philadelphia and in San Jose, California, happening at the same time, right? So it's an ongoing process, and I've just sort of run through the boring chronology of it, right? I want to talk a bit more about the very deliberate effort of building a space in which different kinds of groups can interact. And this is an ongoing debate. In the invitation, the Facebook invitation to this event, somebody posted a note about open spaces, horizontalism, and accountability. There's an ongoing debate about whether or not the social forum is itself democratically enough, if whether or not it is sufficiently open. I think that's a legitimate conversation to have. I happen to believe that those folks are wrong, but I think that it's important that they're available to challenge the social forum to be more than what it is. So I'm going to keep going. I'm just going to do a quick time check. So
you're fine.
Okay, so it's 4:12. I've been speaking for already about 10 minutes, I think. So let me go really quickly. What do we mean by an open space? I think this is the most controversial thing, right? And I think the best way to talk about it is to talk about it in terms of what it is not before we say what it is. What is it not? So on the Boston Social Forum place, we have a set of frequently asked questions, which Jason and I, well, Jason wrote, I think, and I edited, but a lot of folks gave their input into. And one of the things it asks is, you know, what is the social forum? What is an open space? And we also ask, what is a social forum not? And we say, okay, it's not a coalition, it's not an alliance, it's not an organization. So what is it if it's none of those things, right? And so another way to phrase it is, it is a multi-organizational collaborative, except that it involves anyone. Individuals can become involved in the process. You don't have to be representing an organization to take part in the process. So again, what is this open space, right? And how is it different from, say, a playground in which kids go and play with relatively, you know, unguided? Is it a playground? Is it a jamboree? You know, is it a, what's the word for these kinds of concerts that happen? A
festival.
Yeah, a festival. It is a very specific American term for a concert. There are a lot of different groups come together.
You mean like Lollapalooza, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Anyway.
Festival?
Yeah. Festival. Okay. So look, and so I'd like to say a bit more then about what I think this open space is. It's actually an attempt to construct a space. And it's an attempt to construct a space where there is none. Why is there no space? One of the big things about neoliberalism, right? And I think neoliberalism is really an extension of the logic of capitalism. There is a difference, but it is not capitalism. Neoliberalism is a phase of capitalism, right? And this logic is very straightforward. Its attempt is to relentlessly take what is public and make it private, right? So the public is the public space is a space in which we all have rights. It's all and the whole transition to capitalism was about the transition from common land to enclosed land to private land, right? So it's a process that began with the foundation of capitalism itself that neoliberalism takes to its logical conclusion, the complete elimination of public space, right? I'll give you an example of this. I once wanted to go to the United Kingdom. Being a South African citizen, I need a visa to go there. Does the government of the United Kingdom give me the visa to enter to their state? No, it's a private corporation that administers this process, not the British consulate, but a private corporation that charges you, in my case, $200 to apply for a British visa. In other words, the public space and public function has disappeared. And I'll give you an example of a relatively privileged person who wants to travel across borders and how this movement from the public to the private happens. The open space then is an attempt to recover some public space, a space in which debates and conversations can be had. In other words, if I get fired from my job, I can go online and apply for unemployment insurance if I qualify, right? None of my neighbors need to know about it. Maybe I'll feel good about it and it takes away the shame. At the same time, none of my neighbors get to be aware that a lot of their neighbors might be experiencing the same problem, right? Because there is no public space for us to find our common identity, our common struggles. And as long as we're kept apart, as long as there's no public space, there can be no social movement to challenge what would be an unjust situation. And so it's also related to a famous theme within the feminist movement, right? That the personal is political, right? And so this is what the social forum in many ways is about. I have a few other points that I want to make, which I consider important. But at this point, though, are there any questions or comments about what I'm talking about, because what I say next is premised on this idea of the social forum as an open space. No? Okay. You can interrupt me. I'll just go a little bit more forward then. I think the Boston Social Forum, which we held, right? It was an event over 3 days involving some 5,000 people, 550 discrete events, right? And about 200 separate organizations and scores of other individuals participating in it, right? So it was a big thing happening over the space of 3 days. And at the end of it, as promised, there were no demands, right? But what there were instead were lots of collaborations between different groups that previously hadn't worked together, now working together going forward. In other words, I believe that the Boston Social Forum successfully created a space in which different groups could find out what they had in common and develop strategies to deal with that, right? So that's one achievement. I want to go through a list of different kinds of things that happened at the Boston Social Forum. In order not to sort of detain ourselves with details, the website's up, you could visit it and see what the different discussions were, right? Although I should say we had some 30 different tracks, 30 different sort of topic areas, which were in turn explored over the course of those 550 events. Go ahead.
I just wanted to kind of try to imagine how it was if I wasn't there. And then, so was it just like different groups and then people kind of go to each other's groups and talk to each other, or like
that was one thing that happened.
Class that's convening and then they're holding like different talks and then people can go to and start to just do it like by themselves rather than like organizing things.
So my job at the Social Forum, my formal title was the program coordinator, right? And so we had all of those things. We had about 50 different classrooms of different sizes in which the 550 events I mentioned were scheduled, right? So a lot of events were happening, so 50 events were happening simultaneously, right? In addition to that, there were open spaces where people could set up stalls and tables and people could interact with them.
People paid for tables and stuff too. And there were big art events, theater things, stuff going on. You know, there were conferences within the events. There were, you know, like entire conferences that groups wanted to have were held during this thing. But all those rooms were filled with workshops and panels and also all kinds of interactive things. Yeah.
And when they apply for like coming to participate, do they have to have a common theme, or what if they're for liberalism, for example?
I mean, we explicitly, the state principles of the social forum process are fairly explicit that you have to be opposed to militarism and to neoliberalism. And so I would say the experience of the social forum has been that neoliberals never need an invitation and they don't often observe any barriers. So you do have some neoliberal groups who do show up and do take part. And as far as I'm concerned, this isn't necessarily a bad thing because this is an opportunity to engage and challenge them, right? But something else that's interesting that comes out of your point is this. Imagine you're having 50 events at the same time and you only have 5,000 people, right? That means there are going to be some rooms that are totally full and some rooms that are totally empty, right? That's also not a problem as far as I'm concerned. That's an opportunity for people on the left to learn how to promote their activities and to do a reality test. If no one comes to your event, something went wrong. Maybe it's the way in which you promoted it.
They like to blame us, though, of course.
Jason was blaming me.
Yeah, it was all my fault.
But in addition to that, it does mean that you may have to change the way in which you frame things, right? So having this open space isn't a guarantee of an audience. You still have to develop an audience.
We built a superstructure. Okay. I'm sorry, sir.
Right. Sorry, I know we do interrupt each other all the
time.
Well,
you didn't interrupt me.
And I re-interrupted you really quickly. And the reason I re-interrupted you is like the social forum is a process of social learning, right? It's an opportunity for groups to do reality testing and to figure out what works and what doesn't work, to change their framing, or to be completely obtuse and say, no, there isn't a lesson here. We just have to demand that we change the nature of the open space. So this raises a topic with regard to the open space. There are going to be winners and losers. The key thing that organizers should try to do is engage in a dialogue with everyone to try to ensure that it's not the same people who are losing all the time, right? Now, to get back to one of the points that Jason made about who wins and loses all of the time, right? The fact of the matter is we are in a country shaped to this very moment and well into the future, unfortunately, by the fact of its foundation. This is a country shaped by the fact that it is a result of an invasion, right? An invasion from Europe and a genocide of the indigenous people, right? In addition, the other half of the America's original sin is the fact that for a great part of its history, right, it depended on in the trafficking of humans and slave labor to build it, right? This means that we have a horrible legacy of inequality. On the Boston Social Forum website, you'll see we have a people's history, right? A guide to a history of Boston and Massachusetts. There was a screw up, though. That history begins with the arrival of the settlers. It doesn't begin with the story of the people who were here before, right? And so even we, very conscious of these issues, screwed up on this. How does this relate to the open space problem and the fact that there are winners and losers, right? It means that groups with fewer resources generally cannot take advantage of the open space to the degree that other people with a lot more resources. All the organizations Jason was talking about generally often had paid staff people. What about community groups in the three neighborhoods of Boston, especially, that have very little resources because of this history and because of continuing discrimination, right? People from Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan. You know, how do you engineer the open space to be different so that in addition to being an open space, it is an empowering space? And that's a problem that the Boston Social Forum took on by doing very deliberate and focused outreach to those communities. To give you one example, there was an active arts youth festival, which is a very vibrant youth festival that involved mostly young people of color. And more than that, it involved a different kind of culture and a different way of knowing the world. Hip-hop culture was celebrated at the Boston Social Forum through the Active Arts Youth Council conference and through other mechanisms, right? But it was inadequate, right? It was inadequate because although about 2,000 people, right, out of 5,000 came in through the youth festival, right? It meant that we were still separated. We had an open space, but we hadn't pioneered ways to break down the barriers. But perhaps that's way too much for a first social forum, using the methodology of the World Social Forum to achieve. Maybe you need others to achieve it. And indeed, there was another. In 2007, there was the United States Social Forum. And what made the United States Social Forum a bit different from the Boston Social Forum, right, was that clearly it had a lot of money behind it. A lot of foundations supported it. And that's a testament to the power and the great work of a lot of community-based organizations that had developed credibility within their communities and with the foundations to generate their funding. And what they did was they absolutely prioritized the idea that while we want an open space, we want to make sure that people of color are well represented, that indigenous people are well represented in this conversation, that gay people are part of this conversation, and that people with disabilities are part of the conversation. And this was something really important. And in some ways, you know, like many countries do have the principle of affirmative action in their constitutions. South Africa does, India does, quite a few do, right? And the United States does. And I think that that was one of the contributions that the US Social Forum in 2007 made to the idea of the open space. Sure, we can have an open space, but there must be a serious effort to involve communities of color and other excluded groups. On a world scale, this happened as well. In 2004, there was the first social forum was held in India, right? And it was interesting because more than 100,000 people participated in that social forum, right? But it took place in the city of Mumbai, right? And so Mumbai has about 20 million people. So a social forum involving 100,000 people is hardly a blip, right? So that's party. I can imagine if it was held in Shanghai or Beijing, right? What it would be. But anyway, this is a bit of a problem. How does the social forum go beyond the actual physical space of the social forum to have real world outcomes, right? And I think it does because the groups that come together are, in fact, actors in the real world. I'm going to go on to sort of skip a few points, but to talk about one of the continuing debates in the US, in the World Social Forum process, which is this question of horizontalism. At every social forum, there'll be a group of people really concerned about the fact that most of the logistical decisions about the social forum, like the allocation of rooms, all of these things were made by a relatively small group of people. And the fact that the Council of the World Social Forum, something called the International Council, is made up of organizations that are generally fairly sturdy organizations with a fairly long history and with a budget, right? In other words, are we at the level of the World Social Forum replicating the very structures that we want to overturn? And I think that's a legitimate question. Well, what's interesting, though, about the question of the so-called horizontalists ask is, there are no barriers to the horizontalists using the World Social Forum to implement their own horizontal vision. Rather than merely being a voice of opposition, what would be really great is if the horizontalists were to go to the World Social Forum and do what they want to do. And if they did what they wanted to do, then they would have access to the people, and when they have access to people, people could choose to opt in or to opt out. In other words, the social forum has a method of reality testing. People get to decide. An interesting idea, given that neoliberalism makes everything a market decision, where you choose between prices and quality, but you don't get to choose how and why and those kinds of things. Now, the World Social Forum does offer people these opportunities, and this would be something that people who want a horizontal social forum, which is essentially a large assembly, right? The whole room gets together, all 100,000 people, and they make decisions. Maybe they could have a self-governing community, and that would be interesting to see happen. And that's what I think is the challenge to people who are the horizontalists, right? In the meantime, the World Social Forum continues to offer a space, an organized space, sometimes not a very well-organized space, for different groups to organize and come together. It's in this context, right, that the social forum became very portable. It went from Porto Alegre to India, and it went from India back to Porto Alegre several times, but then on to the Middle East after the Arab Spring to Tunis. And so this is a space where people can interact and interesting things can happen out of it. We could go over specifics even in the conversation. Sorry.
Talk about the wins. You like to talk about the wins, like what was won.
Okay.
By the WSF, by us even, like in terms of what happened as a result.
One of the interesting things about the World Social Forum, especially in 2003, Brazil had just had an election at the end of 2002, and they elected a socialist to be president, right? The Workers' Party came to power. And so the World Social Forum was a place to celebrate that victory, right? By the time the next World Social Forum happens, it becomes a place to hold those people accountable, right? Because instead of ushering in radical social change, a few modest, substantial changes were made, but the general system did not change. And so the social forum has been a permanent place in some respects for the conscience of that process, right? And so one of the victories of the World Social Forum, in my opinion, is that it was a space where different groups could hold other groups accountable, right? But then there are more practical, narrower wins. After the World Social Forum happened in Mumbai, India, right? There were elections, and the left won those elections. So maybe the World Social Forum was a space where these folks could come together and strengthen themselves so that they could better participate in the elections. A friend of mine has been making this point quite a bit.
In Brazil too.
Yeah.
Because 2001, the first forum happened.
Yeah.
Elections were 2002.
Yeah.
They played a big role.
Yeah, yeah. So it seems like there is some efficacy to the social forum process for people to actually do real organizing and to come together and yeah. So that was, you know, one set of victories. Probably the most interesting victory that came out of the World Social Forum also happened in around about 2003. So some background really quickly on that. You know, the World Social Forum, as we've described, was a reaction to neoliberalism, right? And we know what neoliberalism is, right? However, there was something else that happened in 2002, which was the build-up to the Iraq War, right? The United States was making the case, turned out to be completely false, right? Most people knew it at the time, except for the media, right, who unfortunately didn't know it. I guess they were outsourcing the work of truth-finding and fact-finding to other people, right? Yeah. So in this build-up to the war in Iraq, there were lots of movements who were concerned about the changing question, right? There's the World Social Forum emerged as an anti-neoliberal thing, and yet here we have the resurgence of, you know, militarism on a world scale, right? So it's a different kind of question. War and peace questions are different from the kind of distributional economic questions that we're talking about. They're clearly interrelated, but one of the things that neoliberalism promised us was a weak state, right? Not a hard state that would be able to carry out military adventures everywhere, right? And what the World Social Forum in 2003 became was an organizing platform to organize what I think is still the largest demonstration in world history. About 15 million people around the world in February of 2003 organized against the war in Iraq, right? Despite that massive mobilization, the war went ahead. Nonetheless, I think that the victory out of that was the fact that we could have a global public. The New York Times, following that demonstration, said there are two superpowers in the world, public opinion and the United States. For me, US military, not the United States people, clearly, right? So those were the two superpowers in the world. I think the World Social Forum was absolutely crucial to the development of at least a critical world public opinion. To the extent that we can strengthen the World Social Forum, I believe, we can strengthen public opinion, human rights, and all of the related processes that depend on people getting together. Those things can be strengthened and be a counterweight to the processes of militarism, to the processes of imperialism, and to continuing neoliberal politics. So on that sort of semi-optimistic note, I think we should make a transition to questions, comments.
Beer.
Those things. Can you, either of you, just say a little about how you could fund the Boston Social Forum?
I think Jason was
Because that raises a lot of points about movements, like, you know, where they were at that point, being able to fund such a
yeah, since Jason's, you know, well aware that he's being live streamed as well on this day.
You mentioned, in contrast, the Atlanta U.S. Social much later with foundation funding.
We developed a strategy with an unfortunate name, kamikaze nonprofit. So the word kamikaze in Japanese means divine wind, and people also know it as the pilots that bravely gave up their lives to slam their planes into the American warships during World War II. It has in America, it has this idea of like a sort of, you know, suicidal, you know, drive to the wall, you know, driving to the point, as we would say in sports terms. We had $50,000 in the campaign on contingent work in 2003, and we basically spent it to the point where I was on unemployment between January of 2004 and right before the Boston Social Forum. You know, we used the money we had to leverage more money. That was a risk, right? and we raised about $250,000. So the risk paid off, right? We were able to, for example, we had to rent the UMass Boston in its entirety, and they charged us close to $50,000 for that, right? So I mean, we were just, obviously spending money on there was a couple of us still on staff at CCW in 2003, I think, was a part of it. I think Yale left at that point. And then NAFI, where Suren worked, was pretty much, I think, budgetarily okay through this period. We were all doing work we weren't technically supposed to be doing. Like, this was supposed to be a project that our boards acceded to. And part of our doing this was a reaction to the constraints of what is often called the nonprofit industrial complex in the US. If you've ever heard the expression military industrial complex in reference to the United States, where the powers that be in this country are basically our big corporations, and a lot of the money that's made is made by contracting to the government for military purposes. Even for stuff that has nothing to do with like war. It's just the money is appropriated via the military budget because no politician dares to say no to the military budget. So the game is to get everything into the military budget that you want to get through, right? So with the nonprofit industrial complex, the thing is like, there are these big foundations. Who are the foundations? The foundations, by and large, were created by corporations and by rich people who own those corporations to get rid of money, to pay less taxes, to get it as a tax write-off, to the extent that any of them have to pay taxes now anyway. But when they did, there was a time when taxes were higher on businesses and on wealthy people. They founded these things, but there's another reason why they founded the foundations. They founded the foundations for the purposes of public relations. So when somebody like Rockefeller founded the Rockefeller Foundation back 100 years ago, it was because the working class movements were so powerful. In that period, it was the socialist and populist movements were so powerful that everybody hated the captains of industry, the leaders of the corporations. So the response was, we'll start the foundation and we'll give money for libraries. Like you'll notice if you go around the US, a lot of libraries are named Rockefeller. Well, that's because Rockefeller Foundation gave them money, right? So these foundations are not apolitical. They serve a political function. And it's if you study political science, if you study politics, if you study sociology, or just are aware, pay attention, you'll be aware that the foundations sort of act as a safety valve for capitalism. So people that would otherwise be in the streets really trying to topple the system, they're like, okay, well, we'll give money to this project. And so the people that run that project are going to sort of be quiet. They're going to do the things that they agreed to do for that money. And then, Suren say, this isn't enough, it's not working. You have money to help these poor people in this neighborhood, and you help maybe 5% of them. But there's still a whole bunch more poor people, and poverty in general is a result of capitalism. So you haven't dealt with the problem. And they're like, well, yeah, but, we have this really great program, and we got young people involved. This is the thinking, right? So, if we behave that way, if we stayed in the silo that Suren referred to, doing what we're supposed to do, which in our case was specific work on organizing contingent workers, like I said, although it turns out our major funder had her foundation that was her billionaire father's money, the French-American Charitable Trust, and then she also was on the board of the Atlantic Group, which was her father's multinational corporation. That group went to friends of mine. A friend of mine was the vice president for a high-tech company. He was sent to India to outsource jobs to India. And her company was making money off of that by being major shareholders in his company and directing them to do certain things. So that's weird. On the one hand, they're funding us to try to figure out how to ameliorate, to make better the situation of workers in these jobs. And on the other hand, they're accelerating the process that creates more bad jobs, both here and in India in this case. Well, that's kind of weird. So, we decided to say, look, we're just going to do this because it's important to do it. We're not going to worry about what happens to us. And there was a price to pay for us. We paid a price. We lost funding later. We had to struggle, and we've had to struggle ever since. Everybody that was in leadership of the Boston Social Forum pretty much, has had a hard time since doing it. But we still think it was worth it. We would do it again. We want to do it again, and we think that we got some good outcomes from it. Even if the organizations and folks and groups that benefited from the forum because they met other movements, other organizations they hadn't worked with before, and then continue doing the work forward, even if they don't remember that the reason their work changed was because of the social forum. We don't care. We'd like them to remember, but we did it for that reason. So it was a success in that sense. So the funding came through, unions like Service Employees International Union gave us $50,000 right at the end, which helped us rent the space at UMass. But most of the money, 60% of the money, was people just paying their fee to go, giving us donations. Just oftentimes we would go speak at public events and people would just give us money. That's how we raised the money. Sorry, that was a long answer.
So do you keep in touch with people you met, like as organizers?
Yeah.
And can you maybe give an example of like the relationship that developed afterwards?
Sure.
We were really excited off the social forum, and we were also broke.
Yeah.
But we
thought we were going to run Massachusetts. It didn't work out that way. So it's like,
Jason thought.
Yeah, I know. Go ahead.
Anyway, sort of a project spun out of the fact that we were so excited by the social forum process. We wondered what would it be like if we could bring together a lot of organizations in a common space, much like the present kind of co-working spaces, So we created in 2006 something called Cinco, this physical location, right? And in the space, like right now, right after it was founded, we had about 20 different organizations with shared office space, right? In addition, about 100 other organizations use the space for meetings and for events and that kind of thing. So in that way, we were able to continue the spirit of the social forum. And most importantly, the kind of spontaneous collaborations that came out of the social forum. This place continued to incubate such collaborations. And in that sense, there's been some fidelity to the relationships begun at the Boston Social Forum. A lot of other interesting things happen. One big topic that really mobilizes the ruling class in this country is Venezuela. What's happening in Venezuela with a lot of polarization in that conversation. I have to be on one side of the pole in terms of thinking about how I approach that situation. But there are a whole lot of groups that were working on the issue, continue to collaborate till this day, as a result of collaborations begun at the Boston Social Forum. And at a very sort of micro level, a couple that I know met at the Boston Social Forum, and they, about a year ago, had their first child. So lots of things came out of the social forum.
How about SEIU's thing at the elections and like the majority of gender? Well, you're the one who usually says that one.
Yeah.
I mean, an example of how organizations use this would also be Service Employees International Union that I mentioned, which is America's largest union. I'm currently a member of it. We still can't dissuade them from constantly backing the Democratic Party, like reflexively, and giving them hundreds of millions of dollars of their members' money, and basically getting backstabbed by the Democrats like all the time, like on every issue. Nevertheless, it was important to them that they try to win the 2004 election for the Democrats, right? So the Boston Social Forum acted as a staging area for their grassroots effort in New Hampshire, which is where our election cycle begins in the U.S. and is also a place that during the run-up to the election, which we were in that period, it's important that polls show in New Hampshire that there's a lot of support for the Democrats, or for whoever is going to win, right? So they organized their grassroots door-to-door response out of the Boston Social Forum, working with groups, especially, we forgot to say, we organized regional or sub-regional committees, okay, around the northeast of the U.S. So there was a New Hampshire and a Maine committee of civil society organizations that formed to get people to the social forum and also to do smaller social fora later. there was a main social forum, for example, about a year and a half later. That's another thing we did. We spawned a number of smaller forums, the Ontario Forum, the Houston Forum, and so on, and we advised them as best we could. But the folks in New Hampshire, from different groups that didn't normally work with SEIU, like the peace movement, got directly involved in this effort at the grassroots to bulk up essentially the progressive response to Bush 2, George Bush Jr., who was about to be elected for his second term. It didn't change the election, but it changed the way the grassroots organizing went in our part of the country. And sectors that didn't work with each other on that before did. Another example would be the Majority Agenda project, I think, that Suren worked on.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of projects came out of it. I would want to clarify something. There was no campaigning done at the Boston Social Forum. That's something we specifically told people they could not do. It was run by a nonprofit organization, and there was no campaigning allowed.
Well, political parties were excluded from the planning committee. That's part of the World Social Forum process. We followed that process.
Yeah, but I think informal relationships and get out the vote efforts did get organized at the Boston Social Forum. So that's one important to say. At the level of the World Social Forum, in terms of collaborations that continue, one of the most interesting ones, I think, or at least two, that I think have reshaped world history, right, is a growing movement that continues to rotate of people who are completely excluded from society, namely in India, the untouchables, right? But they network with groups from throughout, including Taiwan and from Japan, of people who are considered in various ways untouchable. And it was the World Social Forum that became the scaffolding, the skeleton around which they could coalesce, organize, and develop activities. So that was one important thing. Similarly, a very much related group is movements of indigenous people, right? Whilst within the Americas, there was a lot of networking before the social forum process of indigenous peoples groups. This now spread to a global scale, involving groups from Australia, from parts of Indonesia as well. So really interesting kinds of collaborations.
And at our event, we formally invited the Native American nations in the Northeast to come, and some did. Some of our people had direct connection to those folks. It's also worth mentioning all of the landless workers, the workers without land all over the world, the peasant movements, have also, sometimes they participated as in the early part of the social forum process. Sometimes they've actually opposed the social forum process. It depends. Sometimes they think it's too colonized by groups from the global north, from Europe and maybe the US. So, what?
Or the
urban areas, yeah, they feel left out of the planning. I think that was somewhat of the case in Mumbai, or not, I don't remember.
That was one of the debates that happened in Mumbai.
But they have, like the landless workers movement in Brazil particularly, played a big role in the original World Social Forum the first 2 or 3 times. And they played a big role, in the elections in the Workers' Party, for the Workers' Party and stuff, too. So we haven't seen effects that big in the U.S. process, I don't think, yet. But we've seen some of these things that we mentioned regionally, and then the U.S. Social Forum folks, I'm sure, could tell us. And Suren's again involved with the U.S. Social Forum process on the, what do they call the leadership?
Oh, not yet.
Oh, you're not. He's on a subcommittee. So, do people have any questions about how this might be useful in Taiwan, or do you think it wouldn't be useful, or?
Well, tell us how you think it could be useful.
Well, I have a question, but it's not directly in response to Taiwan per se,
Right.
but I can think about it and talk about it later. But Suren, in the beginning, you talked about the World Social Forum as something about drawing the line, expanding the line, or erasing the line. I was hoping that you can just say a little bit more about that and more explicitly. I'm hearing some of the traces there, but I'm not sure if I'm
I
hearing
never developed that point.
Yeah, so I was hoping that you can say a little bit more about that.
One of the interesting things for me about the social forum is that when you go to the World Social Forum, it's just the astounding diversity of groups and topics being addressed, right? So to give you a really interesting set of things, one of the nicest parts of the World Social Forum being held in Brazil is that oftentimes The groups participating include cooperatives and other kinds of non-capitalist enterprises that nonetheless involve, hundreds of thousands of people as part of their market or among their operators and that kind of thing, right? So the World Social Forum is able to bring together institutions that are not necessarily capitalist in nature, that are not necessarily political in nature, but possibly prefigurative of another world to come, right? In other words, the cooperatives and all might be part of a better future, a future that doesn't involve corporations working on a for-profit model, but corporate entities that are operating on not only a non-profit model, but a democratic model. And so what I think it's doing then, right, is erasing lines between capitalism and socialism, right? To the extent that you're able to involve things like these large, very effective cooperatives, right? At the same time, you have many super large nonprofits, which themselves, in some ways rival the practices and the scale of small transnational corporations. And the social forum then becomes a place where you can hold them accountable, you can challenge them, you can hand out leaflets at their event. So that becomes a place where the us and them becomes important, right? The original us and them of the social forum process, though, was the fact that it was held at the same time that the World Economic Forum was happening, right? So at the same time that the World Economic Forum was happening in the global north, Davos, Switzerland, they held the World Social Forum in the global south in Brazil, right? So there's this geographical polarization and drawing of lines, as it were. What's interesting, though, is the next World Social Forum will be held in Montreal, Canada, right? So that's like a bit of a blurring of lines, right? There too. And then when we had the Boston Social Forum, it was interesting because across town, right, at North Station by the Boston Garden.
Oh, the cage.
Yeah, you had Democratic National Convention meeting, which is one half of the U.S. power structure, and we were meeting at a public university across town, representing a very different vision, also involving thousands and thousands of people. So there you have the stark juxtapositioning of these two different ways of operating, different logics of human existence, essentially, different modes of civilization.
And that we should mention, because this is post 9/11, which is something we should have said, because that did change things in the way American politics is done, certainly at the level we do it, outside extra parliamentary politics, outside the sort of standard traditional governance system. Public protest became harder to do. The police began to militarize in ways they hadn't in many cities and elsewhere before. Homeland Security, this new department that was created, none of us ever called the U.S. the homeland. This was just weird, like Nazi language to begin with. And they created this thing, seriously, I mean, they act like Nazis. If I'm a journalist, you try to talk to Homeland Security, they will not talk. They will not talk to journalists. How is this possible? They just don't talk and they get away with it. Anyway, they gave all this money. So all of a sudden we saw Boston for the Democratic National Convention. As we see after the Seattle protest, every time these trade organizations meet, you see the same thing. You see cops and also soldiers with big guns. Now, maybe I don't know about Taiwan, but here that is weird. Like we didn't, it's weird unless you're in a black community or in another disenfranchised community. There was a history of militarized response in those communities, but just in general in the cities and in terms of just public protests like marches and things like that, like in protest of something like the Democratic National Convention, usually, with some exceptions, you didn't see this kind of response. But Boston was militarized. I remember giving interviews like to the global press right as the forum was ending. They were asking, well, what's it like there? I said, what's it like? I see all these guys with big guns, there's helicopters overhead, and then at the site of the Democratic National Convention, there was a protest zone. This was a new thing, right? The zone was a cage. It was covered on all sides, top two, with fence. And it was big enough for 500 people if they were stupid enough to go in there. So we didn't do major demonstrations because a lot of us had decided not to. There were some demonstrations up to, 1,000 people maybe. And most of them were young anarchists, and they refused. I mean, and the peace movement refused. Everybody refused, basically, led by the American Civil Liberties Union, to even go near this thing, and demanded it be dismantled. The government responded by taking the roof off, you know. But it was like really, really weird. And it's been like that ever since. You know, like it's been harder even to do regular demonstrations, as we saw during the Occupy movement. You know, in most cities, Boston included, Boston wasn't the worst, but it wasn't the best either. When the occupiers, who we worked with, and we should say this, like we were both, most people involved in social forum certainly were very supportive of the emergence of the Occupy movement. It was the kind of thing we felt we were prefiguring in the social forum process. And there were similarities, right, politically. But just doing things that used to not be a big deal, like having a march, there'd just be huge numbers of cops, you know, and undercover cops, and federal undercover agents of various kinds. Just really heavy, heavy stuff. The government, together with the corporations, and this has been now exposed in FBI documents that have been released or released by other means, like with WikiLeaks and other, you know, Snowden and stuff. They were coordinating. The corporations and government were coordinating to like dampen this very direct protest against corporate rule down. And in many cities, it was just a military response. Just come in and sweep them off the street. Sometimes people were wounded or even killed, you know. And this is, you know, we're talking about a movement that had a lot of sort of white middle-class people of the type I told you earlier had gotten the better deal for working people in the US historically. Now those people are downwardly mobile. People that work in places like this company are mostly downwardly mobile, because jobs at places like this company are not going to be lifetime jobs. They're going to be, you know, this company could go under as a startup quick, as soon as the venture capital goes away, or gets bored, or decides that they're not making enough money, whatever, gone. All the jobs gone. The jobs that are here, many of them are going to be contract jobs. I'm not imputing this. I'm just saying this is the way business is done now in many sectors of the economy, and that situation is accelerating. So those people that worked at places like this, were in the streets. You know, that has not been the case in most parts of most periods of U.S. history. So where this is going to go, I don't know. Y'all look like we hit you with a bat. Yeah.
So, one of the things that I'm hearing that sort of facilitated the beginning of the World Social Forum is that you were trying to make a difference and make a change. So I'm hearing a lot of coalition has been formed, a lot of connections, and a lot of grassroots communities being brought together. But have you? And this is, I think this is sort of related to what we're trying to do for Taiwan, is that how do we make real changes, and how does that happen, and has it happened? And how do we foster that? So that's sort of the thing that I was thinking about in relation to Taiwan, because I'm a very pessimistic person in this very particular situation with regards to Taiwan.
That's very fair.
We are, you know, I think, especially for people who are here, we work very hard, but we're still a very small group of minority, even in Taiwan, in my opinion, though. Sure. Some people may not agree with me here as well. So that's my question. So I think this is beautifully done and very good ideas behind, but how does real change happen? And has it happened yet? You know?
I mean, I can offer a theory of change that I was certainly telegraphing, others of us were telegraphing at the time. The idea that, like Occupy, like the Sunflower Movement, okay, these movements are basically wave fronts of ideas, liberatory ideas. Things won't really change until all kinds of regular people everywhere decide this isn't good. The way the world is going isn't good. So we cannot prefigure. I mean, I know people want us to say, yes, and then we went forward to a great victory and everything was beautiful. No. I mean, the people that are running the planet are very powerful, very entrenched. And now, because of social media, because of the internet, they have powers of surveillance that governments that are really oppressive, like East Germany or something, could not have dreamed of 30 years ago. You know, like every part of our lives is on camera. Is you know, So I mean, when governments and corporations want to mess with movements, they know exactly who the leaders are. Even the leaders don't believe they're leaders. They know who they are, right? So it's not easy. But there's great reason for pessimism also, because we didn't mention another thing that impelled us was, I mean, Suren and myself and others of our generation were among the early, militant environmentalists. Like, people like us have been talking about the threat of global warming as long as science has known about it, 30, 40 years. And, well, okay, 20, 30 years, sorry, I'm not that old. We're in a situation where our civilization as it exists, at least certainly in industrialized countries like Taiwan or here, is in great jeopardy. We're continuing to extract things from the planet and burn many of those things, which ruins the atmosphere and causes the globe to heat up, which has all kinds of unpredictable consequences. The big ones among them being lack of fresh water, which is an issue that Suren actually works on, and food production. So you have a situation where the general trend is towards more authoritarianism in government and in general, and less available resources for people. We're already having crises all over the world for food and water. Now, millions of people are affected. And then we're going to be losing land because the oceans are rising. That's going to affect Taiwan, I think. It's going to affect Boston. Boston's going to be underwater in 100 years. It will. We know this already. So, how do we deal with that? If we allow the situation to get to major crisis, unfortunately, I'm probably as pessimistic as you. I don't think the movements that we're trying to build are going to stop the chaos that's going to follow. And I worry because the chaos is already happening. We're already seeing wars over resources and water, certainly. Obviously over carbon. There's obviously wars over oil and gas and stuff like that. But there's also wars, or at least incipient struggles, like in Africa. Like Suren could talk more about this than I can, but like resources in Africa are being vied for between like China and the US and Europe. And Africans don't have much say over this. And Africans are already migrating in great numbers away from areas where there's shortages. We're seeing the problems of migration everywhere, like the poor people that died in the ships that sunk in the Mediterranean. You know what I mean? These are major crises. They're brewing. They're getting worse. And all I can say is if the forces of democracy, human rights, social justice don't win bigger and in more places, the planet will be here. I'm not so sure about the people.
I sort of wanted to take a bite at the same apple. Not because I can offer, much grounds for optimism, and sort of just another.
We still have beer.
Yeah, that helps. Totally. That's what I drink every day.
There's also another dimension to it, right? Which is our theories often lead us to be more pessimistic, but our practical work often leads us to be more optimistic. And right, it's a sort of riff on something Antonio Gramsci said, right? But
optimism,
yeah.
Okay. But I'll give you one example, right? And if you indulge a personal example, in 1985, where I lived in South Africa, we were under white rule, right? And every mass demonstration resulted in the police killing people. And when you kill people, people have to be buried. And so the burial itself becomes a mass demonstration. There's still more people are killed. So it's a cycle of violence, right, between the state and the people. And my father's a medical doctor. He went out to help people who were shot in the last round of shootings, right? So it was illegal for him to do so because when you treat gunshot wounds, you're supposed to report it to the government. But the moment you do that, what happens is those people get arrested and they could disappear or be thrown in jail for a long time. And the way he described the work to me, right, was it's just never ending. You see, the moment you stitch up somebody, right, you barely have time to sanitize for the next person, right? And so it just seems endless. And at that moment, right, there was no hope in his mind for social change, right? But the famous slogan, it comes like a thief in the night, right? Social change did come just 5 years later, which opened the door to a totally different government. And although the government continues some of the practices of the old government, the worst kind of evils have not yet been seen, right? And I don't think will be seen because there's been some progress. If I can jump from that more personal kind of thing to something more general, you know, I recently wrote an essay comparing the environmental movement of today with the movement against slavery, right? Slavery in the United States. And when you look at the victory over slavery, it was also something quite unexpected. A battle to keep the United States together becomes a battle for the freedom of slaves, right? And as someone put it, it introduced America to revolution time. What he meant by revolution time was the idea that the doors to struggle open, right? People get together, and this is really important. The act of people getting together is itself, I think, a kind of social change, because suddenly people who are once silent feel empowered, they live their lives differently, and I think that is the beginnings of social change. And so even though right after the slaves are freed, throughout the American South, we have the black codes introduced that attempt to re-enslave people. They never quite succeed. But what does happen in that context is you have a national movement for civil rights emerging in the 1800s under these, in the late 1800s, under most adverse of conditions. And that lays the basis for the victory that Jason spoke about in 1964, the civil rights victory. So I think the victories we have are often unintended outcomes of our present work, but they come with a regularity, and therefore we can expect that they will come again in the future. Will it be enough? And will it be in time? I don't know. But what I do know is that people are developing responses to these things, and there are always examples to inspire us, whether it's Snowden or if it is, you know, on an individual level, or the struggles of Indigenous people in Canada who are saving the planet by stopping corporations from green drilling and that kind of thing. So there are many struggles that are going on that I think are cause for hope. And our only option, I think, is not pessimism, but to build on those struggles and optimism of world.
Thank you.
Hello, Taiwan.
Yeah, you talked about mostly about pressure from governments or big corporations. So do you feel pressure from between social groups? Like for example, they wanted to put so many social groups together to promote some ideas. But obviously you can see so many social groups, they have different focus. And they may struggle to focus what they want to focus on. Yeah. So maybe something may be more popular and something not. So when those more popular ones they become more popular, they become more powerful, they want to influence other groups, and all the other groups don't think that is important. Yes. Maybe they think that, well, you're not my friend, you are actually my enemy. Maybe you are sent from those corporation or governments or something like that. Actually, that happened, and that happened in Hong Kong or Taiwan before. And some people get that they are not sense, they are with the government. Something like that. So do you find this issue here? Something else?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're all humans. People do, politics is politics, right? Everywhere. So there are, and there's a politics of our forum. You know, just doing something like the forum means if we're putting forward one set of ideas, there are other sets of ideas just within the left alone, you know, which is a criticism we certainly have of the left in the US in general. Sometimes it feels like we spend more time debating with each other and never get to fighting our actual opposition, yes? So I mean, an example of, I think what you're talking about, though, I would actually cite something that happened before. One of the things that led up to the Boston Social Forum, the movement to save welfare as a program in the United States. So, which the Campaign on Contingent were the group I mentioned helping start. That was one of the early things we dealt with in 1997, 1998, through to right before the forum, really. And what happened was that the Clinton administration, the Democrats who ran the government, were the ones who were able to get rid of, basically, the welfare programs that primarily benefited single mothers with children, right? Because public assistance for men, mostly black men, by the way, had been destroyed in the 1970s. Tim Costello, the guy I mentioned that we worked with, who's now passed away, which I didn't mention, and we miss him. Tim used to say that most of that aid was city and state-based, somewhat federal, but mostly lower level, and it was called outdoor relief. It was basically jobs programs for men primarily. That had already been destroyed, and that led to homelessness in the U.S. That and the emptying of the mental health hospitals, which were defunded back in the 1980s under Reagan. Those two things are why you see homeless people, right there. Okay, but then women in poverty, right, primarily, as we discovered in organizations, because of contingent work, because the jobs that poor women could get were temp jobs in the 1990s. Were temp jobs, day labor jobs, part-time jobs, contract jobs, right? They never made enough money to get out of poverty, right? And they had kids that men would leave them with, poor men who would just go off and basically be homeless in most cases because there was nothing for them. Marriages break apart, right? Or they go to prison if they're black. Most black men go to prison at some time in their lives in this country. It's true, So they weren't there. So that's who welfare helped. Ronald Reagan started attacking those women as if any of our economic problems are their fault. The poorest people in society, oh, it's their fault. It's the immigrants' fault, whatever, it's their fault. So already much of what they used to have in the 60s and 70s when these systems were most robust after President Johnson's, what was the program called? The Great Society programs. From that period through to Reagan, it was better for poor women. They had more paths to go to college, get job training, but also get good jobs that were government jobs. All that went out the window. They were still getting some money prior to 1998, but in 1997, the Clinton administration eliminated welfare, and they changed it to what they called workfare. The idea is like these women weren't working, which was a lie. They were working. The jobs they worked were bad jobs, and that was what we were dealing with. So we got involved right away, Tim and I, with the coalition in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts was the first place this system was tried before it went federal. Okay, and again, Democrats did this here first. Okay, supposedly progressive Massachusetts. The rest of the country makes fun of us as a bunch of communists. It's stupid, So like, we have Democrats, yes, that run the state, but there's a right wing of the Democrats that are basically Republicans. So they tried here first. It does not work in Massachusetts. It's very bad for the poor women, but they don't care. They declare it a success because they lower the number of people on welfare. They just don't mention that the way they lower it is by throwing them off of welfare. So they throw the poor women off of welfare with nothing else to help them, and that's a great success. Wonderful. So this program is going to be going national. We start protesting in Massachusetts and elsewhere. We get a coalition of the labor movement, which is very unusual. The unions traditionally wouldn't work with the welfare groups because they viewed them as beneath them. This is what you're talking about, right? These groups had different interests, or so they thought, right? And so as it happened, the head of the Labor Federation in Massachusetts, whose name was Bobby Haynes, he grew up on welfare. He grew up in the projects in South Boston. He's a white guy, but he's poor, and his mom was a single mother. So he was very sympathetic to the welfare groups. It's unusual. So we got pretty big rallies going in late 1997, 1,000, 2,000 people on the Boston Common. For an issue like this, that's unusual. And remember that most women on welfare are too poor to be able to go to rallies. One of the reasons that there was so much organizing among poor people in the 60s was that there were public programs that gave them money and jobs so they could organize. And the rich people know this. So they eliminate the programs, there's less protest, right? Just like, so it was important that we were even this big, and in other states it was pretty big too. We lost. The federal program was activated. It went live in 1998. We wanted to continue fighting, a lot of us. But some of the groups that were with us were nonprofit organizations, and they began to get money for these new workfare programs. And so they shut up. Not only did they shut up, but they started to just sort of, behind closed doors, point at people like me as, oh, these are radicals, just ignore these people. Very, very nice, thank you so much. So this is an example of how groups, I think, I'm addressing your point, groups that you would think should work together, things change. In this case, one group got a little bit of power. They had some money from the government to basically screw the people they were supposed to help. And they took it. And that was it. So now our poverty is much worse ever since in Massachusetts. And by the way, who makes the most money off of this system? The very temp agencies that we were fighting against, which I didn't even really talk about much. Temp work, where you go to an agency, you supposedly get a job, but it's not a job. You're just on a list, But if you try to collect unemployment, you can't because you have a job, because it's a temp company and it's considered a job. So the temp companies got to run workfare programs. So these women who are poor because the only jobs they can get are temp jobs are then told, if you don't work for the temp companies that make you poor to begin with, we will not give you any assistance at all. And you cannot complain because you have jobs with the temp companies that are not really jobs. They're just you on a waiting list. This is what this workfare did for millions of people, if you include the children. And now we're seeing the outcomes of those children. You're a psychologist. You see this, I'm sure. The children are all messed up. The children often are undernourished. They don't develop their intellectual capacity. They're forced to work from very young ages, off the books, illegally. All of the things that the social movements of the last 100 years tried to stop, child labor, other things, it's all come back.
That's why I have a job,
Yeah, for now. No. Well, I feel the same way as a teacher. I'm teaching journalism, and there's no journalism jobs.
Yeah, poverty is the main reason that of mental illness, the main cause.
Yeah.
So do you think that social media can really help?
I mean, this is something that I've worked with, Suren's worked with, a lot of us have worked with. I teach it, it's just a tool. And it's a tool that unfortunately is the development of technology is something Suren and I talk about all the time amongst ourselves. We've never had the time or money to do the kinds of projects we want to. Every couple of years, we try to do something called the Digital Media Conference, specifically to look at the social and political dimension of the technologies in question that rarely get discussed. Like, I'm sure a lot of us, since a lot of us have been PhD students, master's students, MFA, whatever, we go to conferences at like MIT, Harvard, and every, yay, technology, oh, it's so wonderful, oh, Arab Spring, oh, it's like, yeah, okay, sunflower revolution, woo, we all use cell phones. Okay, yeah, we did. But like, you talk to someone like Suren who really studies history, you ask Suren about the Egyptian uprising, right? And Suren's going to say, gee, the backbone of that revolution was actually oil workers in the Suez who had been organizing for decades under great repression, and that isn't discussed, right? Because they didn't use social media very much. It was important that the middle-class kids in Cairo, right, did, and telegraphed a certain view of the uprising in Tahrir Square. But that wasn't the whole story, It still takes, whatever technology we have, this kind of thing, that people get together everywhere, all the time, and talk about what they want, and then try to get it. So if we don't do this, it doesn't matter what technology we have. And the other problem that I'm getting at is that the technology is controlled by major corporations. Like Suren and I often talk about CyberSyn. CyberSyn was an early internet that was developed in Chile under Salvador Allende's socialist government. It was way ahead of its time. And one of the first things the dictatorship did when it came in was to destroy it. Why? What it was meant to do was give the government that was elected by the people real-time feedback from all the workplaces and schools about what was going on and what people needed and what people wanted. And then work through this new system to do a better job as a government for the public, in the public interest, for the public good, in a democratic way, where people really had to say. In other words, it's the kind of liberatory use of technology that many theorists in the 1960s and 70s particularly used to talk about when they talked about the cybernetic revolution. That's not what people talk about now. That's not the way people think about the technology. They'll say it's liberatory, but when you look at how it's deployed, all roads lead to Google. All roads lead to Facebook. These billionaires were created with all kinds of power, basically on technology that was developed with public money. People forget this, and they try to talk about the genius of the market. Is it genius to have an iPhone that I can't really control, where all the apps are controlled by corporations, where I can't do certain things that I want to do because they tell me I can't do it? I mean, why is that? That's privatization in a nutshell. That's a lack of democracy. That's a lack of power in this device. Yeah, I like the device, but I don't like that the government can turn it on when it wants and listen to me, for example. So I don't want too much.
So Jason's given you his more pessimistic version of social media. At the same time, he has an optimistic side for you.
I do.
And I think that there is an asymmetry. I think there are emancipatory potentials in social media. The ability of people to connect horizontally, to create new communities and that kind of thing. At the same time, it is subject to hysteria, waves of panic that will spread through the system in ways that separate people. It's also possible to create groups that interact better internally and develop their own culture and then reduce their linkages and capacities to deal with people outside of those groups. So just as much as we can talk about the potential, there's a downside to it too. The most important asymmetry, as far as I'm concerned, is in terms of not access to data, but the ability to compute the data. There's a book by a guy at MIT, Alexander Pentland, called Social Physics, right? It's a very hubristic book, but one of the things he talks about is, crunching massive amounts of data based on the kinds of information we can collect through real-time interactions. So the number of data points go into trillions, right? In order to process so many data points, you not only need massive computing power, which none of us have, or at least none of the regular folks have, right? You can get seconds on Harvard's giant computers if you wanted to access those data and to process it. But more importantly, most activists, people like myself, don't have the skill set to formulate the kinds of questions that someone with the skill set could ask. And the people with the skill sets don't even know about the existence of our world and the kinds of problems that we'd like to address. So there are these really clear asymmetries that it would be great if there were people in the technology field who became more socially aware so that they could tell us what kinds of questions the technology can help us answer. But it has to be a two-way flow. Right now, given the segregation that occurs where the people who are successful in technology will live a lifestyle that's so radically different from those of us who are working on issues of so-called poor people. So we need to figure out how to, because that makes for yet another set of struggles within the struggle that you were alluding to earlier. One other point to make really quickly is that I think the social forum is the ideal process whereby groups can come face to face and try to resolve the differences between them because of the face-to-face interaction. And so that's where I see potential.
I'm curious about what's your take on the format of the corporate funded philanthropy foundations such as Bill and they're also
Good example.
Yeah, so,
What? She's asking about. I can't because I was already starting to think of the answer.
Okay.
Say it again.
Yeah, it's like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So it's the corporate founded, but then they also did a lot of like the thing for poor people.
You should want to go. All right. I sort of started talking about this by talking about the Rockefeller family, who were an earlier version of a captain of industry, as they used to be called, or trust. You know, Gates is a newer entrant, right? So as are people like Elon Musk and folks like the Facebook kid, yeah, Zuckerberg, right? I blocked these names out of my head. And Gates. So Gates, became a billionaire back in the '80s, right? Again, in basically making money off of public technology and also off of the very kind of democratic technology culture that Suren and I were sort of just talking about. The code that he made all his money on, MS-DOS, was based on, although he denies this and there's been lawsuits and everything, on CP/M, another operating system, which was built out of the sort of geek culture, of the 1970s, the garage entrepreneurs who shared information with each other, and they especially shared code with each other, right? I just want to say this. I mean that, the money that he made was by making a deal with IBM, essentially. IBM didn't take software seriously. IBM was the old 1960s, everything's hardware, we need giant computers with big tubes, and that people are not going to have their own computers. They're just going to have, we're going to have these mini and, supercomputers that you can use a terminal, like special priests will service the computer and everyone else will sort of just ask it questions that the priests will do. That's not how it worked out because of this grassroots movement that developed code, that developed microcomputing, that created culture, that created a market, that made it possible to sell millions of units. And people like Gates managed to capture a lot of this money, right? For a technology built with government money, mostly military, and through a democratic culture that made it better, right? So he becomes a billionaire. Okay, now he's got all this money. Now we run into the problem of private capital, right? He's got so much money. People like him have so much money, they have no way to spend it, right? If you just want to live large and buy mansions, yachts, this kind of stuff, most billionaires go through a phase, which sometimes never ends, where they just keep doing this. They just buy a lot of stuff. But at a certain point, they're like, well, I want to involve myself in politics. Usually because the billionaire wants to be richer, okay? Not always. There are some maybe rare pseudo exceptions. I don't take them super seriously, but basically all very, very rich people get involved in politics. There are different ways to do it. We know that in this country, especially since a series of bad Supreme Court decisions culminating in Citizens United a few years ago, corporations could put basically as much money as they want into direct politics. Like nonprofits, Suren mentioned this, we're not allowed to back candidates and stuff like that in the United States, but corporations and corporate leaders, they can do whatever they want, There are some little paper walls, but they're very easy to get around now, right? But there's another way they can get involved in politics, and I started to talk about it. It's these foundations. And the good thing about doing foundations is that they get really good public relations bumps out of what they do. So here's Bill Gates. Bill Gates is trying to, for example, he's giving money to cure malaria or help malaria, right? So he says. Maybe Suren will address this because I think he studied this more than me. But a lot of times, this quote-unquote help actually ends up making more money for the billionaire in different ways. And even if it doesn't, you have to ask, is it good for a single individual simply because that individual is very, very wealthy to be able to change the politics of the planet, right? A more direct example here, though, of what the Gates Foundation does that's negative is it involves itself in public education and essentially works to privatize public education by backing so-called charter schools, okay? In the K through 12 system in the United States for children, right? This country was built, in as much as it was built, largely on the spread of public education around the US and then around the world. Like the US justifiably can be proud that here, it was right here in the Boston area that public education came to be. Like when you see a school like Cambridge and Latin High School in Cambridge, that was one of the, I think it might have been the first public high school in the United States. The Horace Mann School, I think was in Boston, was the first public school for children. at all. Like the idea that a government would pay to send working children to school was a revolutionary idea. That was one of the things that emerged out of the American Revolution that was positive. There were many negative things, but that was a positive one. And it got bigger and bigger. And so the reason that my family did as well as it did, like getting to the middle class, right, for a while, is because my parents were able to go to very good public schools. My mother in Boston and my father in Peabody, very good. I mean, I went to a Catholic high school, which my father opposed correctly, by the way. But the level of education I got at the Catholic high school that cost my family about $1,500 a year by 1984 when I graduated. Now it costs, by the way, $30,000. So families like mine could no longer go to that school. But leave that aside for a minute. The education I got there was basically a college education, a university education, as a high school student. My family's education, my parents, the education they got in Boston and Peabody was of that level. They would learn more than one language. Okay, they'd learn French and Latin, for example, and they already spoke Greek in both their cases. So they both speak like 3 or 4 languages, at least can read it, They had very good math, very good science, This had very strong positive effect on American society, on working people, on their ability to climb up. Now you've got Gates. Now, Bill Gates, right? He's a rich dude. Is he an educator? Does Bill Gates know anything about public education or education in general? All right, smart guy, right? He's famous for reading lots of books. Yeah, but I don't know what the dude's reading, right? Clearly he's not reading the same books I am about education. I studied higher education, at least at the PhD level. I know a couple things about it. He's doing stuff that is undermining this whole system. It's taking money away from the public system and giving it to private entities who do not have to educate everyone. The public system has the mandate to educate everyone, and we take that very seriously in the US. Over the decades, everyone has expanded to mean people who are developmentally disabled, mentally retarded, right? People that didn't used to be considered worthy of an education, right? People that are disabled in other ways. Like, we really tried by the 1970s to literally educate every child, even children that were so-called slow children, whatever, okay? That's all being destroyed, and the first places it's being destroyed is in the urban areas with predominantly black students, who, despite the civil rights movement, remain poor. Okay, so you've got charter schools getting money. The Gates Foundation is pushing the system. It's spending money to influence the federal government, state governments, and local governments to give money to charter schools when that was a solution that was not for a problem that didn't exist. Okay, and now the Gates Foundation and the Lumina Foundation in Massachusetts and other states are going after the public higher education system. So they've just cut a deal that forces the community colleges to run their budgets as if they're a business and to only get a limited amount of money, and then any monies they need above that, and they need it, they can only get through merit. But of course, since their budgets have been cut, they can't possibly meet the targets that allow them to get these so-called extra money, which used to just be their budget. Why do this? So that's getting at an answer, Suren.
No, I understand it.
Look, please stay. Still got some time.
Well, I'm just wondering about what about, so, I'm thinking in the economy things and social forum, what good ideas, but then without like very strong execution, either force or money or whatever. So would it be a possibility? I know there's a lot of fundamental difference between the corporate and the staff, so that really if there's some kind of cooperation that can be formed in perhaps like case by case level.
Yeah, there is. Yes. Yeah, like we got, like there was this guy, what was it called? God, he had a funny name. It was based on the product that he sold, the Tweezer Man. The Tweezer Man. This guy made his money. Okay, yeah, it's okay. He's been a presidential candidate, I think. He didn't get anywhere with it. He's a guy with like left-wing sort of feelings, politics, and he also, I don't know if he inherited the factory or whatever, but he decided to run his factory that makes tweezers, what we call high road jobs. So there's low road jobs, which are these bad jobs we've been talking about. There's also the possibility of companies choosing to have their jobs be high road jobs. They're still corporations, right? He's still making the profit, basically, right? But he's sharing much, much more of it with the workers and saying, yeah, go ahead, unionize, yeah, do all this stuff, and I'll deal with it, it's fine. So I'll still make money. This is what he says. And he does. So that guy gave, money to us, for example. We raised $10,000 from this guy, right, for the Boston Social Forum. And yes, so it's on a case-by-case basis. You got to look at the person or company and decide. And actually, there's a series of science fiction books by Kim Stanley Robinson, the Mars series, the Mars trilogy, about colonization of Mars. And Kim Stanley Robinson has left-wing politics. I think it's a very interesting exploration of this. It's basically saying, there's also a movie from the US called Ice that's very hard to find, but that also shows this. There's a moment in every revolutionary period when people who run these kinds of entities, some of them will decide, I'm going to back the revolution. So good, let them back it. I don't think either of us and anybody we work with believes in the rapture theory of revolution. Like, we don't want a situation where there's a war. Number one, because we'll lose. Number two, because even if we don't lose, what's the point of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people dying in conflict to try to make a better world? I hope we never face the situation where we have to make that decision or die, but I think that it's better to evolve into a better world. It's just, our question is, do we have time for this evolution to take place? Do we have time to find the benevolent capitalists, essentially, that are willing to give up money and power? At least some. I think you have to watch the corporate leaders that are like good on global warming, good on human rights issues. Those are the people that we would want to talk to, right?
Bill Gates on global warming is in favor of a number of technological kinds of solutions that probably will not work. And so the question is, where do we get the resources? The question you pose is, where do we get the resources to do the things we need to do? That question was also asked fairly methodically by Ralph Nader. Do people know who Ralph Nader is? Ralph Nader is quite a storied figure, well-known figure in US history, as a guy who helped introduce a lot of consumer safety legislation into the country by taking on General Motors, right? And so he often is run to the left of the Democratic Party. And he wrote a book recently, about 4 or 5 years ago now, called Only the Super Rich Can Save Us. And in which he really calls on billionaires to help support the movement. In fact, the book opens with a scene where the billionaires are talking to one another and conspiring to do some good. And so that's what he asked.
Reverse subjectivism.
Yeah. And what I took away from the book, there wasn't that particular fact, but I'll say what I think is a good point coming out of the book. But it's a particularly important question where we've just reached the point, right? A few days ago, a study was published, which says that the top 1% in the world own more wealth than the rest of humanity combined, right? So we've reached this, we've gone beyond any kind of meaningful tipping point. It's an unbelievable amount of concentration of wealth. So your question becomes even more pertinent in some ways, right? And so what Nader calls on the billionaires to do isn't what Bill Gates is doing. What Nader calls on the billionaires to do is fund grassroots campaigns so that regular folks can participate in challenging the kinds of power that need to be challenged, right? So Bill Gates isn't really getting his inspiration from Ralph Nader in this. And I think that's the problem, that these are forms of wealth that we can never control. And the thing about revolutions that are interesting, right, is that they're about the creation of new forms of wealth, new ways of doing things, in which the wealth of the ruler doesn't count as much. So the question, I think, is what kinds of innovational organizational experiments can we carry out that make that kind of wealth meaningless and that leverage the untapped wealth, the non-monetizable wealth that we all have, right? Which lay in different kinds of ideas, different kinds of ways of relating to one another, right? So if you could ask yourself, who funded the women's movement? Who funded all those consciousness raising sessions? Because if you take into account the amount of money needed to fund those sessions, that's more wealth than a billionaire could possibly own. That is a leveraging of what is called indigenous wealth based on who the people are and their condition, right? So that I think is what's interesting. That if you are to monetize the amount of money that goes into social change, you're not really measuring it, right? What goes into making social change is all the volunteer hours that people put into things. And that, I think, is far exceeds the kind of wealth that even a billionaire like Bill Gates can bring to the table.
There was a foundation created called the Ms. Foundation that's funded the Ms. magazine to start, and it very deliberately erased the radicals who started the first groups and did all the work that built the movement in the United States. It deliberately kept the radicals away from the magazine. So, you know, it was a pattern, it was a pattern in the United States that wasn't just true to the women's liberation movement, but as Suren said, was grassroots. The activists and the leadership in that movement didn't have foundation funding of any kind. You know, when they were building groups and writing articles and all this. But by the time Ms. Magazine arose, it had very clear establishment funding with a very clear purpose, which was to make sure the public that would read Ms. Magazine, the women reading it, wouldn't know of what happened before. So most women today will tell you that they know Gloria Steinem, but they don't know the radicals who started, you know, the women's liberation movement that themselves have been in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the student movement.
Such as?
So, you know, they might not know Carol Hanisch, who coined the term the personal is political. You know, they don't know that that history was deliberately, you know, erased from that effort. So the other example that comes to mind about foundations affecting a very clear political position was there was a group in Boston, very famous, that wrote Our Bodies, Ourselves. That book has been translated to many, many languages and it was part of what we call the women's health movement, okay, which opposed corporate-run healthcare that was not meeting the needs of women's healthcare. So it turns out that group that wrote Our Bodies, Ourselves was given an offer by a foundation, and by accepting that money, they no longer, as an organization, called for national health care. Radicals of the women's liberation movement continue to call for national health care as a major part of women's liberation. If you don't have a system of health care by right that isn't dependent on you being married to a man who gets health care through his employer, or doesn't depend on you having a job or a husband that gives you health care, then that is a major it's like a underpinning without which women's liberation can't exist. So national health care is necessary for there to be women's liberation in everyday life. And that organization had to stop calling for national health care. It used to before, as a part of calling for women's rights and women's liberation. And that's because the foundation that provided it funding to have a staff, a budget, an office, said you cannot also call for national health care. We don't believe in it. We want a private healthcare system. We will not give you money if you continue to call for that as part of your program. So that's a pretty big change for that group to have done that.
There's another example, all of you would know, the movie Can Win It Too. was given some money, I think, when the director. So it's a Taiwanese movie. It's about local Taiwan history. I actually haven't watched it, but many of you have seen it. So this is what Fu Kai told me. Maybe I'm misrepresenting it. But he said the director of the movie was given some money to produce this movie. So he did a lot of research, interviewed a lot of indigenous Taiwanese people and all the groups that were involved. And then I think Gongshi, so this is a public Taiwanese public TV station, wanted to show it or something, some kind of organization wanted to show it. But then they say, well, but this section of the movie you may not show, which is a very important part of the movie. So the director essentially took a big hit and he did not take the money, but he wanted to show this movie to the public. So some of us are involved in raising money to give access to local Taiwanese people. So they're really helping out people to show this movie to the Taiwanese public. But so basically there's a history that they don't want people to know. So they say you may not show it in this movie. So this is an example of how the funding can also change the direction of whatever you're trying to do.
Yeah, this happens all the time in media. Because a lot of my friends are filmmakers, the nonprofit that my news publication is part of, they're all documentary filmmakers. It's very hard, especially when you want to get stuff like on national public TV or regular TV or get distributed to many movie theaters. It becomes difficult because often the money you need to get to that level comes with these strings. Or sometimes our government will even directly involve itself. Like when our public broadcasting system did a show on a documentary on the Korean War. It's a very political topic in the US, right? The government, like the CIA and others, were involved in its production. They stopped certain discussions from happening. Just didn't allow it, So I mean, there are other. It's just depressing stuff.
So I guess at this point, I'm just like throwing out ideas. And just for me, it seems like, or the general left, or are just about like protesting. But wouldn't it be like maybe like a way to infiltrate into to become like the top politician or the very rich, and then to become the one that can really think to implement ideas rather than always on the other side and then complaining about how like bad the situation is and how difficult it is to overcome like all these bad people doing these things. So sometimes I feel frustrated about it. Just like,
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, who studies sociology here ever? A little bit maybe. I mean, look, there's an idea like in sociology of structure versus agency. So yeah, you can. There are some people that are able to get those kinds of public offices or run a big corporation or whatever, and they have certain internal politics. The problem is that politics becomes more and more internal the higher and higher they get. It's very rare. Like even look at Pope Francis, the leader of the Catholic Church right now. That's surprising that a guy like this ends up as Pope. Right, because it's a pretty conservative. I mean, he and to get there, right, he had to make some deals through the course of his career. Like he didn't speak up a lot during the dictatorship in Argentina when he was a mid-level functionary in the Catholic Church. Because if he had, he would have been killed. So that's understandable. But he also may have, I think, directly hurt some families. Giving them away or something like this. It's controversial, right? But I mean, he had to make certain compromises to survive. Then he survived, but he actually retained a moral core. Okay, so now he's doing some interesting stuff and involving himself in some geopolitical situations in interesting ways. That is very, very unusual. It's just like this. It's like when we used to have kings and emperors. If you got a good king, things are pretty good. But if you got a bad king, you were screwed, because if you give up your voice as a person, if you say that, well, these people are just protesting, whatever. I mean, protesting is part of politics. It's like if people don't have what we call in the U.S. the right to redress, the right to protest, the right to say that something is unjust, that our situation isn't right, we want things to change, then things will never change. I mean, that's a dialectic, right? I mean, if you don't, power exceeds to nothing without a demand is the old saying, right? So if you don't speak, speech is very powerful, even though it doesn't seem it's powerful sometimes. If you don't speak, nothing changes. And the assumption is that everything's okay. I mean, maybe this is the Confucian system in a nutshell, right? You know?
We could spend a while, I think, talking about that.
We could. It was very progressive in its day, I know. But, you know, maybe 4,000, 2,000 years later, I mean, it wasn't.
Just really quickly, one point. I don't think the left is only about protesting. I think the left is about building things like community gardens. They're about building cooperatives. They're about building credit unions and all sorts of institutions that I think prefigure the next society. They're about producing TV shows that show different values. If you look at the battle against domestic abuse, it was largely won on TV. If you look at the battle for gay rights and the right to marry, all of these things come about because there are people struggling in other spheres, protesting for sure, but doing other kinds of things that change people's values. And the left has been good at it. Are we sufficiently good? Will we be good enough in time? Maybe not, but we I think, moving in the right direction. We're not only about protests. I think the right wing would like to reduce us to a bunch of people protesting on the streets. But we've been creating new values. The whole women's movement that people are talking about. A new civilization was born in the 20th century because the left did more than protest. It changed the way in which the family operates.
But I mean, you know, there's truth to what you say in the sense that I remember during the social forum period, we were having discussions about our belief that a lot of the social movements that we were connected to after the 1960s and 70s did become kind of like you're describing. It was sort of just, it's the way that the right wing often typifies left-wing protests, professional protesters, right? And we were very interested in actually people like you in this room, the people with genuine expertise, genuine professional expertise, the people that you need to actually run an advanced industrial society have to be part of the movements and have to change the institutions that you are all in. That includes politicians. So it is true, right? You have to, well, what's the expression? We walk on 2 feet, right? Or 2 legs, is that the expression you always use? What's the expression?
Not a Chinese guy who said the expression.
Yeah. All right, whatever. We can do more than one thing at the same time. I mean, we can protest sometimes, but we also have to actually run a society. And people are not going to accept any new leadership from any movement, democratic or not, if they don't believe that those people are capable of running a society and things being nice, reasonable, you know, people being able to have decent jobs, have healthcare, have education, have all these things, and not suffer some giant environmental cataclysm, you know, in the next few decades. So it's true, right? But sometimes those experts also have to protest, or else it's not going to work. That's why some of the most famous protests in history are from people like here in this country, from Noam Chomsky, from Howard Zinn. Like, why do we care about these people? Well, because in most societies, somebody who's a very elite professor and researcher doesn't speak up like that. Those two men criticized their professors, for not speaking up about the Vietnam War, for example, or about civil rights. Like taking their privilege and not being critical of the system that they were part of, or the system they were upholding, right? That's why people respect them. You know, they respect people who've achieved a certain amount in life. So those people are important leaders, but if they don't, Marie's always says the civil rights movement expression was leaders are those who go first, the people that are willing to stand up in public and express certain views. Depending on their social position, they can reach many, many people. So,
so you don't think that, well, sometimes we said that, well, you're protesting, that means that you may hate some players, you may hate the rule, but some people have said that if you want to really do something, to be influential, you have to be part of the system.
Right.
So some people think, oh, well, and some people get into a system and kind of sell their soul to the table. So,
Yeah.
so do you think that that is so, or you can still get your integrity?
I mean, when I'm angry at some, corporate person, I can personalize it and talk about selling soul to the devil of it. But I mean, really though, it's bad to think like that. I think we talk a lot in movement circles about inside-outside strategy. You can't do it without people on the quote-unquote inside. And it may be a mistake to think about, to dichotomize inside-outside. What does that really mean? Every entity, corporation or whatever, is a human entity. It has many entrance and exit points. It connects to many other entities in society, right? So if we think it's problematic because it's sort of like a dictatorship, we're not going to change like a corporation without people in it who want change, right? We might change it by eliminating that category of entity legally. We might say, as some communist countries did, there will be no corporations. But I mean, practically, I don't think that's what's going to happen. And I'm not sure that would be desirable. There are reasons why corporations have been successful entities in history. They do have certain value, right? The way they're able to mobilize resources at their best and to make things happen that can be good, right? So yeah, I wouldn't want to say that. I would want to just encourage people to do what they can at their workplace, but also when they can go outside, understanding that some employers will say no protest. Like if you work for National Public Radio as a journalist, this has happened, and you go to a protest and you're not covering it as a journalist and they find out, they'll fire you, okay? So there are also regular corporations, very conservative ones, that will do this kind of thing, that will try to regulate their workers' free time, So, but most companies are not that bad, So, you can work someplace like this. You can go be an Occupy as long as you do your work, and don't get in any super visible trouble that makes the company look bad. They're probably not going to care. So I encourage people to do this. It's part of human existence, to speak up for yourself. We're at 6 o'clock.
Yeah. Any more questions? Now then, we can thank you. And I also want to thank our volunteers who helped this month, Cafephilo. That will be Jiajun and Herbert, and Jibo and Tony. Yep. So Jibo's writing up a summary essay.
Good luck with that.
He'll send to you guys. All right. Thank you.